Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about America's overpopulated future, climate change, quality of life, species extinction, plastic oceans, our contaminated biosphere, and other adventures and issues with a six-continent world bicycle traveler. My guest is Frosty Wooldridge. He is a speaker, writer, and adventurer who has authored over 17 books, including America's Overpopulation Predicament, Blindsiding Future Generations. He's written Immigration's Unarmed Invasion, Deadly Consequences, as well as numerous books on bicycling, rafting, and exploring the world. He was formerly a college guidance counselor at Michigan State University and Grand Valley State University, and he also taught math and science in Brighton, Colorado. He has received numerous awards, including the Top Rotary Award for Speaking Leadership and a medal for serving in Antarctica. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone listening to this broadcast. Obviously, this is a sobering broadcast brought to you by a teacher, certainly a guidance counselor, former United States Army officer, and certainly world explorer. I've had the good fortune in my life to have traveled all the way to the Wall of China, and I've also stood on the South Pole. And in those journeys, and also with my having scuba dived in all the oceans of the world, I've gotten to see all the changes in the last 50 years that have occurred here in America, but also worldwide. As a matter of fact, I stood there on Michigan State campus back in 1970, an Earth Day, and the biggest conversation was human overpopulation. And at the time, you don't think about it because you don't see it. There were 3.5 billion human beings on the planet. And of course, since that moment of the Earth Day, created by Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin, we have now added well over 4 billion more of ourselves. In fact, we're at 8.1 billion, and we're adding 83 million net gain every single year, new babies across the planet. And it didn't dawn on me because here in America, we had 194 million people back in 1965, and finally in 1970, we had about 198 million. And so it wasn't something that was concerning. But in 1984, I did one of my 3 times around the world on a bicycle. I bicycled up to the Wall of China. I also started right there in Hong Kong and went through Beijing and went through Hangzhou and Shanghai and the Summer Palace, you name it. And it changed my entire understanding because I saw at that point well over, I think it was about 1.1 billion people. And of course, I also then traveled through India and Bangladesh. When you go through those countries, it changes your total understanding of the human dilemma, and that was back in the 20th century, and now we've added over 4 billion more to make this literally a human tragedy, but also a whole Earth tragedy. All the animals that are going extinct right now, we're now in the 6th extinction session, which is taking out, according to E.O. Wilson from Harvard, about 100 species per day. And in fact, E.O. Wilson, who just passed away recently, and I got to meet him, on course by 2050 to lose 1/3 of all vertebrate species on the planet from human contamination of habitat and loss of habitat because of human numbers expanding. And by the end of the century, we're going to lose half of all vertebrate creatures on the planet. So the human mob, if you will, or the human horde, is not stopping. You hear all the reports that, well, the birth rates are going down and so forth, but it's called population momentum, and that was brought on by Dr. Albert Bartlett, a man whom I worked with for over 30 years at the University of Colorado, and his extraordinary hour-long seminar really educated us to what we're facing.
Indeed, you bring up so many important points. One is that when people see how other people people are living in the world, one recognizes that our carrying capacity on this planet is limited, that the resources are not there for everybody, and that we cannot continue that continuous growth of population everywhere in the world. You also bring up the impact of too many people on the planet. You mentioned Earth Day, and I coordinated the first one here in Southern California. I was speaking about 5 to 10 species a day becoming extinct. You pointed out that it's now 100 species becoming extinct. This kind of loss, you also have quoted very famous oceanographer and environmentalist and conservationist Jacques Cousteau, who said that the two root causes of our environmental crisis is exploding population growth and the wasteful consumption of irreplaceable resources. And you do discuss in your books, in your talks, the impacts of what is happening when we are using too much of our finite energy resources and creating the plastic garbage patches in our oceans.
There's no question that we have done a great deal of degrading of the environment here in the last 50 years. Having been a scuba diver since 1963, I got to see the oceans turn from pristine to plastic. As a matter of fact, Scott Simon on NPR just a month ago said that we now have 170 trillion pieces of plastic and microplastics floating on the surface of the oceans and also down below. That's 170 trillion pieces of plastic that are now getting into the tissue of the fish. So we're actually eating our own petrol, our oil, in the foods we're eating. And so that's the tragedy. One of the ironic aspects of what's happening around the planet is that America, which has had an extraordinarily unlimited opportunity for resources of water, of energy, and of course everything that makes this civilization operate, is now facing an addition of somewhere between 80 and 100 million more people net gain by 2050. As Dr. Albert Bartlett stated, and I'm quoting, unlimited population growth cannot be sustained. You cannot sustain growth in the rates of the consumption of resources. No species can overrun the carrying capacity of a finite landmass. This law cannot be repealed and is non-negotiable, unquote. I knew Dr. Bartlett for 30 years because I lived in Boulder, Colorado, and the man was brilliant, and he was obviously extraordinarily understanding, if you will, of what we're facing. And anyone that you can go to albartlett.org and listen to his 1-hour seminar showing that we can't keep doing what we're doing to ourselves. It's called the exponential growth factor. What that means is it's the same thing as a cancer cell, and a cancer cell will keep growing and using its host, which in many cases are human beings, until it kills the host and it kills itself. Well, right now you can take that same reality and use human beings as the cancer cell that is unlimited growth until it simply kills the planet. And what I would like to do, or at least share with you, and hopefully it gets around and becomes a dinner table conversations, diner conversations, restaurant conversations, and it should be conversations across the United States of America on every newscast, is that we cannot sustain another 80 to 100 million more people here in the United States and then still maintain our civilization, because in the end, exponential growth always ends in collapse. And as a matter of fact, one of my other friends, Christopher O. Clugston, wrote a book, and I would highly recommend it to anyone. It's called Blip, Humanity's 300-Year Self-Terminating Experiment with Industrialism. And what he shows in that book is the fact that we will run out of the energy, the water, and the resources that make this civilization work. If we don't change course, we're literally going to collapse the civilization, because once you don't have the water and once you don't have the energy, and you certainly don't have the resources, whether it's a battery or lead or zinc or copper or all the things that make everything that we are able to function, then we can no longer function. As Dr. Albert Bartlett said, unlimited growth cannot be sustained. We need a conversation, not only of the president, but the vice president and the governors of every state, because each one is facing this reality, and that's why I hope that we keep educating American citizens to start talking about it instead of avoiding it. I'm excited that we have a chance to educate ourselves to the choices that we must make here in the early part of this century, and we need to do it very quickly. If I can be a voice for anyone and everyone, speaking at colleges, educating enough people, then we can make this change to stabilize the human race, stabilize the population, and decline it to a viable number so that we can all have have a sustainable future, all of us humans and all the rest of the plants and animals on the planet. That's the most important thing to me.
What is the solution to solving our climate change problem, our ecosystem destruction, our animal extinction, and having a quality of life for people?
The human race really has to stabilize and actually lower its numbers here in the 21st century and do it very, very quickly. I have proposed, along with other demographers, that we have an international one child per woman by choice so that we can save the human race and all the rest of the animals on the planet. And we need to do it, and we need to do it very soon.
You mentioned the population growth in the United States, but you've also pointed out that Africa will jump from 1.4 billion to 2 billion by 2050. India will jump from 1.42 billion to 1.5 billion by 2050, and China will jump from 1 billion to 1.5 billion by 2050 as well. These are figures from the United Nations World Population Projections. So it's both an American problem and a worldwide problem. Every place in the world we are using resources. Water's finite. Energy, as you pointed out, the oil that has enabled a 100-year window for unlimited energy is closing, and renewable energy is not necessarily going to be able to take care of the billions of people. And then we are polluting not just with the plastics that you mentioned, but with chemicals. 84,000 chemicals find their way to what you call the final toilet, the oceans, every year. This is astronomically gigantic and horrible in terms of pollutants for the animals and plants in the oceans and those of us who use the oceans ourselves.
You're exactly correct, Nancy, and I present a one-hour program with a slideshow, which is called The Coming Population Crisis in America and How to Change Course. And one of the things that's happening to this country is that we have been essentially a receptacle for all this overpopulation in the world, and that's why we jumped from that 194 million back in 1965 to now well over 335 to 340 million that we know of in this country, on our way to topping 400 million within the next 27 years. What's ironic to me, or frustrating, and if not actually exasperating, is that no one wants to talk about it.
Part of the problem with modern technology and science is we've created a lot of chemicals, and we have unleashed GMOs, which are very dangerous to the population of life. We've created glyphosate. What is the threat about these particular chemicals and technologies?
Well, with all the studies I've done and the research I've done, glyphosates, which are now in Roundup or Weed Be Gone or all of the different weed killers, are now morphing into the land and the air and the water. They've actually killed off 90% of the monarch butterfly there in California, and that's a tragedy. But you also see all of the other chemicals are now heading into the oceans, and they're changing the way that the ecology of the oceans, absolutely destroying the ecology of the oceans. But the GMOs, those things are genetically modified organisms. 90% of the corn and 90% of the soy is now GMOs. The problem is the human gut is not prepared to deal with a new kind of genetic DNA of corn, and that's why you're having tremendous problems across the United States of America with people's guts, because the biome in the gut's being destroyed by the GMOs, and it's going to only get worse, and yet we could solve it in a heartbeat. Literally ban GMOs. I think they've been banned in Europe. I know they've banned glyphosates like Roundup, and we need to do that worldwide. It means that we, the American people, and certainly people around the planet, have got to stand up and stop this, because companies like Monsanto will not stop it. The bottom line for them is the dollar, not human health or animal health or world health or the natural world. They don't care.
And we are going to talk more about the solutions to the overpopulation issue, the environmental, sociological, and quality of life issues, and compelling reasons that we need to change course when we return in a moment with my guest, Frosty Wooldridge.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, Here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Frosty Wooldridge. He is a speaker, writer, adventurer, has authored over 17 books on bicycling, rafting, exploring the world, and about the overpopulation issue. Your recent book, America's Overpopulation Predicament, Blindsiding Future Generations, is a superb read. It's full of information, but yet it's not boring. It's not tedious reading. You quote so many different experts, scientists, and present many different reasons why you believe that we need to change course, that we need to help people in their own countries so that everybody has a quality of life, health, education, welfare, stability, economic, environmental, that they're not destroying the planet. I enjoyed your presentation of the tragedy of the commons, which was a concept presented by the world-famous Dr. Garrett Hardin, who really created the human ecology field. You made that explanation so understandable. Could you give that to us?
Well, I certainly could, Nancy, and thank you very much. Garrett Hardin and his wife were absolutely brilliant ecologists. Anyone can go to the GarrettHardinSociety.org, and you can really read and or listen to his extraordinary understanding of the tragedy of the commons. And there's several ways to interpret it, but it gets down to this. You can have a paddock or a pasture, and that pasture can be, let's just say, 5 acres, and you have 2 horses in that pasture, and you have a water tank. That water tank will take care of and make sure that the 2 horses can drink all the water they want, and they can graze on that 5 acres of land or grass, or you can even make it a 10 acre. It doesn't make any difference. It's always a finite acreage because the earth is finite, and so every paddock or every pasture is also finite. Those 2 horses can eat, they can play, they can frolic. They have obviously horse waste also, and the waste gets taken up in the rain. It gets thrown back into the soil so the grass grows greener. Everything is in balance. The commons is usable and it's sustainable, and you can continue to use it literally forever. However, if you put in 100 horses into that commons, that pasture, all of a sudden you've got horses drinking the tank of water down to nothing, and then you have conflict, and then of course they eat the pasture down to nothing, and now they're fighting for resources. In other words, those horses, 100 of them, are resource competitors. And so that's what Garrett Hardin showed in the tragedy of the commons, that when you have too many horses in a finite landmass, that means the carrying capacity will only hold so many, where once they were balanced, they're now completely unbalanced, and you're going to have conflict. And so here in the 21st century, as humans continue to outgrow and become part of the tragedy of the commons, you're seeing the same thing happen in the United States of America, but it's worldwide. The latest United Nations figures show that 4 million children under the age of 12 die of starvation every year. I'm almost positive that 8 million adults die from poverty and starvation or lack of nutrition worldwide. So that's somewhere around 12 million people. And of course, there's another billion people that can't get a clean glass of drinking water because of those 84,000 chemicals that have been spewed into the land, into the water, into the air every year for the last 50, 60, 70 years since World War II. And in fact, the lucite and certainly the mustard gas from World War II was dumped into the oceans after World War II and has been circulating around the planet. But now we have another aspect. I was a reporter for the Antarctic Sun down in Antarctica, and I lived there for 6 months. I talked to some of the greatest scientists on the planet, and they told me about catastrophic climate destabilization, now known as climate change, global warming, you name it. They said this is going to be the real killer because species cannot adapt fast enough to changes in temperature.
You have provided so much excellent, superb information from so many experts. In your book, you've quoted Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb back in the 60s, who helped lead the effort in terms of the environmental movement focusing on population issues. You also encourage people to watch a short 5-minute video by Roy Beck, who's director of NumbersUSA.org, about immigration, poverty, and gumballs. I've seen him do that demonstration. Can you explain that?
One of the things as a teacher, I had 3 months off every summer. And in 1984, I got to travel through all of Asia, and I got to see the numbers, and they were horrific. But what Roy Beck did was create a simple gumball demonstration. What he shows is that you have all these people, and they're adding 80 million new babies net gain every year as the human race climbs toward 8 billion, which we've now obviously reached, and we're headed for 9 billion. We actually add about a billion every 12 years right now. We should hit somewhere around 10 billion by mid-century, give or take. But what he shows in this gumball demonstration is no matter how many of these 83 million people, it's 80 million in his demonstration, but it's now up to 83 million per year, new babies net gain added to the planet. The United States takes on 1 million every year and has been since 1965 with the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. Well, guess what? You can take on 1 million, but now there's still 79 million more babies that need some place to go because they can't feed them, they can't water them, they certainly can't educate them, and they can't work them. And so the overload is so horrific, and at the end of the demonstration, he takes another bunch of millions, and he pours them into the gumball tube, and guess what? All of these gumballs simply fall all over the floor. In other words, they can't be sustained, you can't water them, you can't feed them, and there's no way any amount of immigration is going to save them. And so what he says in his speech, that they have to live where they're planted. In other words, all these different countries have to start engaging birth control. And of course, that goes against a lot of the religious aspects of different religions. But those religions are so entrenched, they will not hear of or incorporate birth control.
And as you mentioned, they have to move to the current century and not stay in the Middle Ages. You have so much great information in your book that I wish we had time to have you explain and present to us, but people can read America's Overpopulation Predicament, Blindsiding Future Generations, and you also have lots of great information on your website. What is that?
I have two websites. One of them is www.frostywooldridge.com, and that's my serious one with all of the population information. Frosty Wooldridge, Frostywooldridge.com. I have another one that's a fun one. It's called HowToLiveALifeOfAdventure.com, and that's what I would like to see future generations enjoy. A life of adventure, a life of freedom, a life of quality of experience. It's all quality of life, and that's what I'm working for, because I would hate to see Americans by 2050 living the kind of misery that they're living in Africa right now, or they're living in India, or they're living in China, or Indochina. All the places that I've visited, their lives are really substandard. They're struggling, they're starving, they're living really miserable lives. The environment is shot to heck, and their lives are really marginal. That's what's going to happen to the United States if we continue on the same path that we're on right now, and if we do add that next 80 to 100 million people to the United States of America.
While you are very serious about the need for people to care about overpopulation and to deal with this critical issue, you also want people to have fun as you have had fun, and you have books. Some of your books about your adventures are fun titles too. Handbook for Touring Bicyclists, Strike 3, Take Your Base, Bicycling Around the World, Tire Tracks for Your Imagination, Bicycling the Continental Divide, Slice of Heaven, Taste of Hell, and Rafting the Rolling Thunder. And you generally have a book about how to live a life of adventure, the art of exploring the world. Is the basic bottom line just going out and enjoying the world by seeing it, doing it on your own 2 feet, or if necessary, with the extra 2 wheels of a bicycle?
Well, certainly everybody has a definition for their own experience as far as adventure, and I celebrate everybody, whether they're a stamp collector or a macrame artist or a tennis player or a pickleball player. Each one of us really was designed to enjoy and have fun on this planet. I actually have a book out called Living Your Spectacular Life. It's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and I had friends ask me years ago, why don't you write a book and show us how to live a life of adventure like you've been doing? And I said, well, I can do that. And so I put 12 concepts and practices that anyone at any age can plug into, and all of a sudden, if they want to be a rafting captain, I show them how to be a rafting captain. They want to be a tour guide on a bicycle trip, I show them how to do that. If they want to play pickleball, I give them all of the tools on how to live a spectacular life, how to find their dream, how to chase it, how to catch it, and how to live it, because I've been fortunate enough to do it in my own life, and I can tell you, I'm just a little farm boy milking selling cows at the age of 15 in Leroy, Michigan, population 500. And yet I've traveled the world, almost 100 countries, on 6 continents, stood on the South Pole, certainly stood on the wall of China, scuba dived all the oceans, and it's been a fun time. And I would hope that and wish that for every citizen of the planet to enjoy the same things that I've had. That's why I've written all these books, is to encourage them, to inspire them, and to really move them toward their own adventures, whatever they choose on this planet during their lifetimes.
I, too, have traveled the world, done documentaries in many, many countries, and seen and enjoyed the people, the cultures, the wild areas, the ecosystems, and the wildlife. Was there one special animal that you encountered that really was a highlight of your travels?
You know, I've had some pretty amazing encounters with animals throughout my life. Probably one of the most amazing moments was I was living and working at McMurdo Base there in Antarctica, and there was a report of a family of penguins on the ice, so I literally jumped on my bicycle, and there's 8 miles out to the runway where the big planes came in, because the ice is about 12 to 15 feet thick, and so they could actually land the planes. And so I took off on the ice runway, and honest to gosh, I rode out about 2 miles, and all of a sudden I saw this family. There was a family, a male, female, and the 2 kids, and one was a little older than the other. And I got off my bike, and it was like 20 below zero. I looked like a big stuffed bunny with my bunny boots and you name it. But I sat down in the snow, and it's called sastrugi. It's with the wind blown. There's tubulars, and there's triangles, and there's squares. It's just the ice pack is what it's called. And I sat there, and they came right at me, and the lead penguin was the father, I guessed. And I took off my glove. I had 3 gloves, actually, and I took off all 3 of my gloves, and I stuck my hand out. And that emperor penguin, they're about 40 pounds. They stand almost 3 feet high. He literally scratched his beak in my outstretched palm of my hand. That was one of the great moments. And then the female penguin, after he was scratching his beak in my hand, the female pecked him on the back, and he jerked back at that point, and they turned around and they waddled off. And one of the little baby penguins seemed to want to come over and scratch my hand too with its beak, but he or she then turned and walked away. And so with all my encounters with animals over the world, that was probably one of the most unique of my life.
I love hearing your stories.
Thank you. Well, I've scuba dived all over the Gulf. I've scuba dived on Jem Pennekamp Park. I've scuba dived in the Blue Sink and the Morrison Spring. You name it. I've scuba dived all the oceans of the world. Well, we're destroying the reefs, and when you start destroying the reefs, you destroy the wildlife in the reefs. We kill, and this has been documented by Julia Whitty and Life magazine. For the last 30 years, we've been killing 100 million sharks every year in our oceans. That's what human beings have been doing. And these sharks are going extinct, and then they are the major predators, and as they get killed off, then everything else goes into disarray, and the ecological systems can't balance themselves out without what has been built up by the millennia. And so we, the American people, are about to be victims ourselves. Look at Phoenix this summer. It was 121 degrees in Phoenix a couple days, and they had, I think, over 100 degrees for over 30 days. So there's no way that we can continue to disrupt the climate like we are and hope to survive it, because, again, we're about to add 80 million to 100 million more Americans, and all of them are burning fuel. They're burning gasoline, or even if they're burning electricity in the EV cars, they're still charging those cars with petrol. And that's what we're facing. It's called a Faustian bargain. I can quote this to you by Walter Youngquist, and he's an energy expert that just passed away, and I met him at a conversation in Washington, D.C. years ago. He says, and I'm quoting, "As we go from this happy hydrocarbon bubble we have reached now to a renewable energy resource economy, which we must do in this century, will the civil part of civilization survive? As we all know, there is no way that alternative energy resources can supply the amount of per capita energy we enjoy now from gasoline, much less the 9 to 10 billion people expected by 2050. And energy is what keeps this game going. We are involved in a Faustian bargain, selling our economic souls for the luxurious life of the moment, but sooner or later the price has to be paid," unquote.
Thank you so very much for leading us onto the new path that we must follow so that we have a quality of life for humans on the planet, and so that the planet can have other species live their lives as well. Thank you for being my guest.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Nancy.
I have been speaking with Frosty Wooldridge. He is a speaker speaker, writer, adventurer, and author of over 17 books. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.